December 14th, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Oberst Friedrich von der Heydte crouched in a frozen foxhole as his 6th fallschirmjäger regiment prepared for the opening hours of what would become the Battle of the Bulge. A veteran of Crete, Russia, and Normandy, von der Heydte had survived Soviet artillery at Kursk and British bombardments at Caen. He believed he understood what artillery could do to men and terrain. Then, at 0642 hours, American counter-battery fire found his positions. What happened in the next 18 minutes would shatter every assumption von der Heydte held about artillery warfare. The barrage didn't build gradually like Soviet fire. It didn't arrive in measured, predictable patterns like British guns. Instead, 6 American artillery battalions, positioned across 15 kilometers of front, delivered their shells simultaneously onto his regiment's assembly areas. Not in sequence, not in waves, simultaneously. Every gun fired so that every shell landed within the same 60-second window. The Americans called it time on target. The Germans would come to call it the thunder of judgment. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Von der Heydte's regiment suffered 37% casualties before firing a single shot. His carefully planned assault dissolved into chaos. But the casualties weren't what haunted him during his subsequent interrogation by American intelligence officers. It was the precision, the simultaneity, the overwhelming coordination that suggested the Americans had industrialized artillery the way they had industrialized everything else. When asked to compare American artillery to Soviet and British fire, von der Heydte's response would be recorded in U.S. Army historical archives. The Russians overwhelm you with quantity. The British impress you with precision. The Americans terrify you with both, delivered faster than human reaction allows. The German Wehrmacht entered World War II as the most experienced artillery force in Europe. They had studied the lessons of the Great War exhaustively, understanding that artillery killed more soldiers than any other weapon system. German gunners were superbly trained, their equipment was excellent, and their doctrine emphasized flexibility and rapid response. They had developed combined arms integration that allowed infantry, armor, and artillery to work seamlessly together. This expertise made German military leaders particularly qualified to evaluate enemy artillery, and their evaluation of American guns would prove devastating to German morale. German artillery observers first encountered Soviet firepower during Operation Barbarossa in 1941. The experience taught them that Soviet artillery doctrine emphasized mass over precision. Russian guns would saturate entire map squares with shells, assuming that volume of fire would compensate for accuracy. A Soviet artillery preparation might involve 300 guns firing over a 2-hour period, gradually pulverizing defensive positions through sheer tonnage of explosives. German soldiers learned to dig deeper, disperse wider, and wait out the bombardment. Casualties were heavy, but Soviet artillery was predictable. You knew it was coming. You knew it would last for hours. You prepared accordingly. The mathematics of Soviet artillery were straightforward. If you fired enough shells over enough time, at enough terrain, you would eventually destroy whatever was there. German defensive doctrine adapted. They created deep defensive systems with multiple fallback positions. When Soviet artillery began, German troops moved to reinforced bunkers or withdrew to secondary lines. The shells would fall on empty positions for hours. Then, when Soviet infantry advanced, German troops would emerge and counterattack. Soviet artillery was fearsome in its scale, absolutely, but it was manageable through proper defensive preparation. British artillery presented different challenges. German forces first faced concentrated British fire during the North Africa campaign, and later in Italy and Normandy. British gunners were methodical, professional, and devastatingly accurate. They had perfected techniques developed during World War I, particularly the creeping barrage, that moved forward at precise intervals ahead of attacking infantry. British forward observers were skilled at adjusting fire onto specific targets. Their communication systems were reliable. Their ammunition quality was excellent. German soldiers respected British artillery deeply, but British doctrine emphasized conservation. Ammunition had to be transported across oceans, so British commanders used artillery carefully, targeting specific objectives rather than saturating entire areas. A British bombardment was surgical. If they were firing at your position, it meant they had identified you specifically and were methodically destroying you with a minimum waste of shells. This made British artillery dangerous, but again, understandable within German military framework. Good equipment, well-trained crews, sound doctrine executed properly. Dangerous, yes, but operating within parameters German military science recognized. Then, the Americans arrived in North Africa in late 1942, and German artillery observers began filing reports that senior officers initially dismissed as exaggeration or panic. The Americans were firing artillery in ways that violated German understanding of how guns should be employed. They wasted ammunition prodigiously, firing 100-round barrages at targets that required perhaps 10 shells. They had no sense of conservation, treating artillery shells the way a man might treat bullets from an automatic rifle, firing constantly with no apparent concern for supply. This wastefulness should have been their weakness. Instead, it proved to be a devastating strength. American artillery doctrine had been developed by men who understood that the United States could produce shells faster than any army could fire them. This single insight revolutionized how Americans thought about artillery employment. Where European armies asked, how do we use our limited artillery ammunition most effectively? Americans asked, how do we deliver the maximum amount of explosive force in the minimum amount of time? The answers to these different questions produced entirely different artillery systems. The foundation of American artillery superiority began in factories in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois. By 1943, American industry was producing artillery ammunition at rates that German intelligence initially refused to believe. A single American ammunition plant produced more shells monthly than the entire German ammunition industry produced quarterly. The numbers seemed impossible. German factories, operating with slave labor and dwindling resources, produced approximately 3 million artillery shells monthly in 1944. American factories produced 20 million shells monthly during the same period, and production was accelerating rather than declining. This industrial foundation enabled American artillery doctrine that German gunners found incomprehensible. American forward observers called for fire missions that would consume hundreds of shells to destroy single targets. German officers calculated that such expenditures would exhaust ammunition supplies within days. But American supplies never ran low. Ships arrived weekly in French ports, carrying more artillery ammunition than the entire Wehrmacht possessed. Trains hauled shells forward faster than guns could fire them. Ammunition dumps contained more explosives than German armies had fired in entire campaigns. The second element of American artillery superiority was technological. American guns, particularly the M2A1 105mm howitzer and the M1 155mm howitzer, incorporated innovations that German weapons lacked. American pieces featured hydraulic recoil systems that reduced firing time. They had optical sights superior to German equivalents. Most importantly, they were designed for mass production with interchangeable parts. When an American gun broke, mechanics swapped components in minutes. When German guns broke, specialized gunsmiths were required for repairs that took hours or days. But the technology that truly revolutionized American artillery was radio communication. Every American artillery unit from battalion level down possessed multiple radios with reliable long-range capability. Forward observers accompanying infantry could call for fire support and receive it within minutes. Fire direction centers could coordinate multiple batteries to fire simultaneously on single targets. This communications network meant that American artillery could respond to threats with speed that German artillery, still dependent on telephone lines that were easily cut, could never match. The third element was training and doctrine. American artillery officers studied German and British methods, then deliberately rejected both. They weren't interested in conservation or surgical precision. They wanted overwhelming firepower delivered instantly. American doctrine emphasized time-on-target missions where multiple batteries calculated firing solutions so that shells from guns kilometers apart would impact simultaneously. The technical difficulty of these missions was extreme. Different guns at different ranges required different powder charges and different elevation angles. Shells traveled at different velocities depending on distance. Coordinating 6 batteries to put shells on target within seconds required mathematical calculations that German fire direction centers found astonishing. German artillery officers first encountered time-on-target missions in Italy in early 1944. Oberst Karl Thieme, commanding artillery for the 76th Panzer Corps, observed American fire missions near Anzio and filed reports that his superiors suspected were fabricated. The Americans fired from positions ranging between 3 and 8 kilometers from target, 6 batteries, 36 guns total. The shells arrived within a 15-second window. Our observers counted 94 impacts before the smoke obscured counting. The target, a reinforced company position, ceased to exist. Time from first radio call to first impact was 4 minutes. This shouldn't be possible with current fire direction technology. But it was possible because Americans had created fire direction centers equipped with mechanical calculators, pre-computed firing tables, and radio networks that allowed unprecedented coordination. While German fire direction officers calculated trajectories using slide rules and paper charts, American fire direction centers used mechanical computers that could solve firing solutions in seconds. This speed advantage meant American artillery could respond to targets of opportunity before they disappeared. German units, moving during daylight, learned to expect American artillery within minutes of being spotted. The fourth element of American artillery superiority was the forward observer system. Americans embedded artillery observers with every infantry company, equipped them with radios, trained them extensively in calling fire missions, and gave them authority to direct entire battalions onto targets they identified. This decentralization shocked German officers accustomed to centralized fire control. A 23-year-old American lieutenant with an infantry company possessed more artillery support, accessible more quickly than a German regimental commander. These forward observers developed into highly skilled specialists who understood both infantry tactics and artillery capabilities. They accompanied attacks, identified targets, calculated adjustments, and directed fire while under enemy fire themselves. German snipers learned to target American officers carrying radios and map cases. Understanding these men controlled devastating firepower. But killing individual observers didn't solve the problem, because Americans simply trained more. By 1944, the American Army was producing artillery observers faster than combat could eliminate them. The psychological impact of American artillery on German soldiers exceeded its physical destructiveness. Soviet artillery was terrifying in its scale, but German soldiers understood it. Massive bombardments, long duration, survivable if you had deep cover. British artillery was frightening in its accuracy, but predictable in its patterns. American artillery was neither understandable nor predictable. It appeared without warning, delivered overwhelming force in seconds, then stopped just as suddenly. German soldiers never knew when it would come, where it would fall, or how long it would last. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr Division, described American artillery in his post-war interrogation with unusual emotion for a professional officer. American artillery was a weapon of terror. not because of what it did to positions, but what it did to minds. My veterans from Russia would break under American fire when they had held under Russian bombardment. The difference was predictability. Russian artillery prepared you for death. You had time to accept it, pray, write letters. American artillery gave no time. One moment silence. Next moment your world exploded. Then silence again. This randomness, this instant violence, destroyed men's ability to function. The mathematical precision behind American time-on-target missions revealed industrial thinking applied to warfare. German fire direction required 15 to 20 minutes to coordinate even 2 batteries onto a single target. Americans coordinated 6 batteries in 4 minutes. This speed differential meant German forces attempting to maneuver during daylight faced artillery before they could complete movements. Hauptmann Josef Schreiber, operations officer for the 352nd Volksgrenadier Division, documented 19 separate American artillery strikes on his division during a single day in January 1945. Each strike lasted less than 3 minutes. Each appeared without warning. Cumulative casualties exceeded those from a full day of Soviet bombardment, but the psychological damage was incalculable. American artillery doctrine emphasized something German military thinking had never prioritized: the complete destruction of enemy formations before friendly infantry engaged them. Soviet doctrine accepted that artillery would weaken enemies that infantry would finish. British doctrine saw artillery as support for infantry attacks. American doctrine treated artillery as the primary weapon system, with infantry occupying ground that artillery had already rendered uninhabitable. This philosophical difference produced tactical results that shattered German units. The Battle of Mortain in August 1944 provided devastating demonstration of American artillery philosophy. German forces launched Operation Lüttich, attempting to cut through American lines and reach the coast, splitting Allied forces. The 2nd SS Panzer Division and elements of 1st SS Panzer Division, among Germany's most elite formations, attacked at night, achieving initial surprise. By dawn, they had penetrated 6 kilometers into American positions. Then, American artillery found them. Generalfeldmarschall Günther von Kluge, commanding German forces in France, believed night attacks would minimize artillery vulnerability. He had calculated correctly that American forward observers couldn't adjust fire, they couldn't see. What he hadn't understood was that Americans had solved the night observation problem by putting forward observers in aircraft. Throughout the night of August 6th to 7th, American artillery spotter planes orbited over the battlefield, dropping flares and directing fire from artillery battalions positioned across 30 kilometers of front. The results were catastrophic for German forces. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, which had begun the attack with 89 operational tanks, lost 43 tanks to American artillery before encountering a single American tank. Not to airstrikes, though those came later, to artillery exclusively. SS Oberführer Christian Teixen, commanding the division's 2nd SS Panzer Regiment, was killed by artillery fire, along with his entire command group. His replacement, SS Sturmbannführer Rudolf Enseling, survived less than 6 hours before artillery fire destroyed his command vehicle. German survivors of Mortain reported that American artillery seemed omniscient, finding every concentration of vehicles or troops within minutes. The reality was less mysterious but more impressive. American artillery battalions had established what they called a fire direction net, a radio network linking every artillery unit in the sector. When any observer identified a target, every gun that could range it received firing data simultaneously. A German tank column spotted by one forward observer might receive fire from 4 battalions within 3 minutes. This coordination, impossible with German communication technology, made American artillery appear impossibly responsive. The integration of American air and ground artillery created a combined arms system that German forces found overwhelming. Fighter bombers equipped with radios could communicate directly with ground artillery forward observers, coordinating strikes that alternated air attack with artillery fire, giving German forces no respite. During the Falaise Pocket Battle in August 1944, retreating German forces found themselves trapped in terrain where American artillery and aircraft operated in deliberate sequence. Artillery would strike, forcing German troops into cover. When artillery lifted, aircraft would attack vehicles and concentrations. When aircraft departed for refueling, artillery would resume. Oberst Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, Chief of Staff for 7th Army, attempted to organize withdrawal through the Falaise Gap under these conditions. His after-action report, recovered from German archives, documented the systematic destruction of combat capability through coordinated fire. American artillery possessed complete information about our positions and movements. Their shells arrived continuously, not in bombardments, but in attacks of 3 to 5 minutes duration, repeated hourly. This prevented rest, prevented organization, prevented effective withdrawal. Combined with air attack during daylight, it created conditions where unit cohesion simply dissolved. The Battle of Heydte Forest, from September to December 1944, demonstrated that American artillery remained effective even in terrain that should have negated its advantages. The dense forest canopy prevented aerial observation. The rough terrain complicated logistics. German forces had prepared extensive fortifications. Traditional military wisdom suggested artillery would be less effective in such conditions. American doctrine adapted rather than accepted limitations. American artillery forward observers in Heydte Forest worked closer to German positions than doctrine recommended, sometimes within 200 meters, directing fire onto bunkers and strongpoints they could identify despite limited visibility. They developed new techniques for forest fighting, using tree bursts where shells detonated in forest canopy, showering defenders with metal fragments and wooden splinters. German soldiers discovered that positions providing excellent protection from direct fire offered little safety from tree bursts that rained destruction from above. General Major Rudolf von Gersdorf, observing Heydte fighting, reported to his superiors that American artillery had found methods to defeat prepared defenses, even in unfavorable terrain. They use proximity fuses that detonate shells in treetops. The effect is devastating. Men in bunkers that withstood direct hits are killed by fragments entering through vision slits and firing ports. Casualties in the open are universal. We calculated forest terrain would reduce artillery effectiveness by 60%. Instead, American methods have increased lethality. The proximity fuse, one of the war's most closely guarded secrets, represented American technological innovation applied to artillery. Traditional artillery shells detonated on impact or after a timed delay. Proximity fuses used radio waves to detect nearness to targets, detonating shells at optimal height above ground or troops. The technology was so revolutionary that Americans initially restricted its use to areas where Germany couldn't recover unexploded shells for examination. By late 1944, with German forces retreating everywhere, restrictions were lifted. The effect on German morale was immediate and severe. German soldiers called proximity-fused shells devil's ammunition, or witch shells, because they seemed to possess supernatural ability to detonate at the worst possible moment. Troops attempting to dig foxholes were killed by shells exploding overhead. Soldiers behind walls or in shallow trenches were killed by fragments that descended vertically. The psychological impact exceeded the increased lethality. German troops felt that American artillery had become impossible to survive through any conventional protection method. American ammunition supply rates enabled artillery employment that German logistics couldn't support. During the Battle of the Bulge, American artillery battalions fired unlimited defensive fires, meaning forward observers could call for as many shells as they believed necessary without regard to supply constraints. The 75th Infantry Division's artillery, defending near Echternach, fired over 12,000 rounds on December 16th alone. More shells than the entire German 7th Army fired during the same period. This ammunition abundance transformed how artillery functioned tactically. German artillery commanders husbanded ammunition carefully, firing only when targets justified the expenditure. American artillery commanders fired whenever targets appeared, knowing resupply was continuous. A German forward observer, seeing 3 enemy soldiers in the open, might not call for fire, judging the target insufficient to justify shell expenditure. An American forward observer, seeing 3 enemy soldiers, would call for a battery volley, 6 guns firing 3 rounds each, 54 shells to kill 3 men. This seemed wasteful by European standards. Americans called it certainty. The psychological burden on German artillery crews grew as the war progressed. German gunners understood they were outmatched not by training or courage, but by industrial capacity they couldn't overcome. An experienced German artillery battery could fire perhaps 40 rounds per gun before requiring resupply. American batteries fired 300 rounds per gun daily and received resupply overnight. German batteries moved positions to avoid counter-battery fire and found their new positions targeted within hours. American counter-battery radar, another technological advantage, could locate German guns after 3 to 4 rounds and direct return fire within minutes. Hauptmann Klaus Huber, commanding a battery of the 952nd Artillery Regiment, described the futility in letters captured after his death near Aachen. "We fire 6 rounds and must displace immediately or die. Americans fire 600 rounds from the same position without consequence. Our shells are rationed. Theirs are unlimited. We are gunners attempting to fight a factory. The outcome was predetermined before we fired the first shot." The battle for Aachen in October 1944 showcased American artillery's ability to reduce fortified cities through sheer volume of fire. German forces had fortified Aachen extensively, creating strong points in concrete buildings and underground positions that should have required months to overcome. American artillery fired over 17,000 shells into the city during the first 3 days of fighting. Forward observers accompanied infantry room by room, calling for direct fire on individual buildings. By battle's end, American artillery had fired 169,000 rounds into 5 square kilometers of urban terrain. Oberst Gerhard Wilk, commanding the Aachen garrison, surrendered after 21 days of fighting, not because his troops lost courage, but because the systematic artillery destruction made continued defense meaningless. His surrender report noted that American artillery had destroyed every prepared strongpoint, collapsed most underground positions, and rendered 90% of the city's buildings uninhabitable. They possess unlimited ammunition and use it without restraint. They demolished our fortifications by simple persistence, firing thousands of shells where dozens should have sufficed. German attempts to counter American artillery superiority failed repeatedly because they addressed tactical problems with strategic solutions beyond Germany's capability. German forces attempted to attack American ammunition dumps, but found them so numerous and dispersed that destroying them had no impact on ammunition availability. They attempted to target American artillery positions, but American guns moved frequently and were protected by extensive counter-battery fires. They attempted to infiltrate and kill forward observers, but Americans simply trained more observers and integrated them at every level. The most successful German counter-artillery tactic was simply to avoid concentrating forces where American artillery could target them effectively. Small unit infiltration tactics, night movement and dispersion reduced vulnerability, but also reduced combat effectiveness. German forces found themselves choosing between fighting effectively and exposing themselves to artillery, or surviving artillery by avoiding fighting. This dilemma had no solution within German operational capability. By early 1945, German soldiers feared American artillery more than any other aspect of American military power. Post-war surveys of German prisoners consistently ranked artillery as the most feared weapon system, ahead of tanks, aircraft, or infantry. The fear wasn't based solely on casualties, though those were severe. It was based on helplessness. Against tanks, German soldiers could fight with Panzerfausts. Against aircraft, they could dig in and survive. Against infantry, they could return fire. Against American artillery appearing without warning, delivering overwhelming force in seconds, then vanishing, German soldiers had no effective response. Obergefreiter Hans Woltersdorf, captured near Cologne in February 1945, expressed what countless German soldiers felt. You cannot fight their artillery. You cannot hide from it. You cannot predict it. You wait, knowing shells will come eventually, not knowing when or where. This waiting destroys men's spirits worse than the shells destroy their bodies. Russian artillery, you understand. British artillery, you respect. American artillery, you simply fear, hopelessly and constantly. The American artillery system's effectiveness stemmed from integration of factors that individually were impressive but collectively were overwhelming. Industrial capacity provided unlimited ammunition. Technology provided superior guns, communications, and fuses. Doctrine emphasized speed, coordination, and overwhelming force. Training produced skilled crews and forward observers at every level. Combined, these created an artillery system that German military science couldn't counter because it operated outside the parameters German military thinking recognized as possible. German artillery officers studied American methods in captivity, attempting to understand how Americans achieved results German doctrine declared impossible. Their conclusions were unanimous. Americans had industrialized warfare completely, treating combat as a manufacturing problem where sufficient resources and organization could overwhelm any defense. They had transformed artillery from a support weapon into the decisive weapon system, relegating infantry and armor to mopping up roles after artillery had shattered enemy formations. The human cost of American artillery superiority appeared in German casualty statistics that showed artillery causing 60 to 70% of all wounds and deaths on the Western Front during 1944 and 1945. Soviet artillery on the Eastern Front caused approximately 50% of casualties, despite firing far more shells. The difference was American precision and coordination. Soviet artillery saturated areas. American artillery destroyed targets. Both killed extensively, but American methods killed more efficiently per shell fired. German medical personnel reported wound patterns from American artillery that differed from Soviet or British fire. American proximity fuse bursts caused extensive fragment wounds to head, neck, and shoulders, areas unprotected even in foxholes. American time-on-target strikes caused mass casualties simultaneously, overwhelming medical capabilities instantly. The concentrated violence of American artillery left survivors describing scenes that resembled industrial accidents more than traditional combat, men and equipment simply torn apart by sudden, overwhelming explosive force. The philosophical implications of American artillery superiority extended beyond tactical or operational considerations. German military tradition emphasized individual soldier quality, unit cohesion, and tactical excellence. Americans demonstrated that industrial capacity and systematic organization could defeat traditional military virtues through sheer material superiority. This realization was devastating to German military culture, which had defined itself through professional excellence and fighting spirit. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, Wehrmacht Chief of Operations, reflected during post-war interrogation on what American artillery represented. We prepared for war against armies. We faced war against factories. American artillery proved that industrial production matters more than military skill. They built a system that required less training, less genius, less courage than ours, yet defeated us through superior resources and organization. This is the future of warfare. The nation with the greatest industrial capacity will dominate, regardless of military tradition. The transformation of warfare that American artillery represented would define military thinking for generations. The lesson was clear. In industrial warfare, the ability to produce and deliver overwhelming firepower mattered more than tactical brilliance or individual courage. American artillery demonstrated that systematic organization of sufficient resources could achieve results that military genius alone couldn't match. German generals who had studied Clausewitz and mastered battlefield maneuver were defeated by American officers who understood logistics and industrial production. The German soldiers who survived American artillery carried memories that shaped their understanding of why Germany lost. It wasn't primarily due to being outnumbered, though they were. It wasn't primarily due to tactical defeats, though those occurred. They lost because Americans could deliver unlimited explosives anywhere on the battlefield faster than German forces could react, creating conditions where traditional military virtues became irrelevant. Courage couldn't stop shells, training couldn't predict them, excellence couldn't overcome them. In the shattered cities and cratered fields of Germany in May 1945, the evidence of American artillery superiority lay everywhere. German fortifications built to withstand siege warfare for months had collapsed under days of concentrated bombardment. German armies that had conquered Europe through tactical excellence were scattered by firepower that made maneuver impossible. The Wehrmacht, which had revolutionized mobile warfare, was defeated by an enemy that revolutionized industrial warfare. The artillery crews who achieved this transformation were ordinary Americans, many barely trained, compared to German professional soldiers who operated within a system that multiplied their effectiveness exponentially. They weren't individually superior to German gunners. They were part of an artillery system that was collectively unstoppable. They represented American warfare philosophy: adequate training, plus overwhelming resources, plus efficient organization equals victory, regardless of enemy quality. German military professionals struggled for years after the war to understand how they had been defeated by what they perceived as American military mediocrity. The answer was that Americans had redefined military effectiveness. Where Germans measured effectiveness by training level, tactical skill, and fighting spirit, Americans measured effectiveness by industrial output, logistical efficiency, and systematic organization. By American metrics, their artillery was supremely effective. By German metrics, American methods seemed crude and wasteful. The results proved American metrics mattered more. The legacy of American artillery superiority in World War II influenced military doctrine worldwide. Armies recognized that firepower delivered rapidly in overwhelming amounts could achieve results that traditional military methods couldn't match. The lesson of American artillery wasn't subtle. Industrial capacity wins modern wars. Nations that could produce and deliver greater firepower would dominate those that relied on traditional military virtues. This realization shaped the Cold War, the arms race, and military thinking through the present day. For German soldiers who fought on the Western Front, American artillery remained their most vivid memory of combat, more than tanks, aircraft, or infantry. It was the weapon that made them feel most helpless, most vulnerable, most certain of defeat. Soviet artillery frightened them with its scale. British artillery impressed them with its precision. American artillery terrified them with both qualities combined and delivered faster than human nerves could process. The thunder of American guns announced not just tactical defeat, but the end of traditional warfare and the beginning of industrial war that Germany couldn't win. The story of why Germans feared American artillery more than Soviet or British firepower is ultimately the story of how industrial civilization transformed warfare. It's a story of American factory workers who never saw combat, but defeated German armies by producing unlimited ammunition. It's a story of engineers who designed guns, radios, and fuses that multiplied effectiveness of average soldiers. It's a story of doctrine writers who understood that enough resources, properly organized, defeat genius and courage. Most of all, it's a story of how warfare changed forever when nations brought their full industrial capacity to the battlefield. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.